Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending on where you are in the world and what time you decide to watch this. I hope this live stream finds you well. Today, I am going to be joined by Eric of the Cross and the Crescent discussion group. If I've got that name wrong, I'm sure he'll correct me. A channel that I want to wholeheartedly encourage that you all immediately go to and subscribe. I will update the info box to include a link to his channel, and he's more than welcome to share it in the chat. We're going to be looking at the question that haunts the Islamic world, which is the evidence for Mecca or the lack thereof. Because according to Islamic history, according to the Islamic standard narrative, Mecca was a major settlement in the 7th century, able to field large armies, and was a developed trade center and pilgrimage place of pagan Arabia. However, there's a massive absence of evidence, and Muslims believe that this is a city that has existed since the time, a settlement that has existed since the time of Adam and Abraham. And yet there seems to be no or scant, if any, evidence of its existence in the 7th century. And all the sort of statements to its existence seem to come later. And Muslims apologists often appeal to Ptolemy as a sort of get around. Ptolemy, I'll let Eric introduce for you, and I don't want to steal any of his thunder, but it's essentially an apologetic that's used. So we're now looking at very specific details, that apologetic answer that makes use of Ptolemy, and asking whether it actually, that argument stands up to scrutiny. And that is going to be today's live stream. If you enjoy what I am doing and you believe in the evangelistic work that I'm doing towards our Muslim brothers and sisters in Adam, then if you want to support, all the links are in the description box. I just need to clarify for those of you that don't know, because I've learned that some people are supporting Soko Films thinking that they're supporting me. It's great you're supporting Soko Films. I want to encourage you to do that, but I need to be clear, I am not in any way funded or supported by Soko Films. So I just appear on that channel a lot. So there you go. So without further ado, let me bring in Eric. Peace with you, Eric. How are you?
Good morning. How are you?
Good morning for you. Good afternoon for me. I think you look the better for it, to be honest.
Yeah, I just got out of bed well, it's been a couple hours since I got out of bed.
Yeah, I've been out of bed a while, and I still look worse than you. So.
Well, I tell you what, I'm sporting that Donald Trump orange man look. My wife and I just got back from Florida yesterday, and
right.
I went and watched the Yankees lose. But while watching them lose, I got sunburned.
Nice. So no fake tan then?
No, it's not. I'm supposed to stay out of the sun because I've had skin cancer before, but I lathered up.
Dude.
Yeah,
yes, you should.
Yeah,
get some suntan on.
Well,
you have to be in England to look this pale. Like you have to be in England to look like you're ill perpetually.
Well, you're quite a few miles north of where I am, anyways. So yeah. I get that.
Brilliant.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
I've wanted to have you on for so long. I've really appreciated your channel. Your presentations on your channel are absolutely amazing and informative. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing your presentation today. And like I say, guys, just name your channel so everyone can go away and subscribe to it.
Yes, it's called the Cross and the Crescent Discussion Group. We've been up for probably on YouTube, I guess, for probably about 3 years. We had a temporary sabbatical last fall because I got doxxed, but it's back up and running, and we are on YouTube. We live stream every Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Central Standard Time. That's Chicago time. It'd be 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you're not familiar with U.S. time, that's New York time. And we go for about 2 hours, and we have a panel of people that come on, and we discuss various topics. They are generally polemical in nature, critiquing Islam. But we do provide quite a few shows. We do quite a few shows that are apologetic in nature, also defending the gospel of Jesus Christ. So it's a mixed bag of things, but we get several different opinions. At the same time, I do try to do presentations every week on whatever the topic may be.
Brilliant. And I'm going to be coming on your channel to do some responses. So that'll be interesting when that happens, but more on that later. Do you want to open us in a prayer, Eric?
Yeah, absolutely. My favorite psalm, and I know this is kind of a cliche, but it's the 23rd Psalm. It comes right after the 22nd Psalm, which is your prophetic song. But the Psalm of David provides me all kinds of comfort. So I'd like to pray that if you would. The psalmist writes, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leads me by the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I would dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Amen.
This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. And it's also a pleasure to be in the presence of a confessor, someone who is suffering and has suffered for the faith. And I want to encourage Christians in America to get behind Eric, because he's got stuff going on. Anyway, so Eric, on to the presentation. Would you like your slides up, sir?
Yes, yeah, go ahead and put the slides up. Yes, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about not necessarily the historicity of Mecca today. Well, we are going to be talking about the historicity of Mecca, but one of the rescuing devices that Taoist, Gandhist, my verbiage, provide when we ask them, okay, if you're going to say that Mecca is this all-important city, what is your evidence for this? And they will often say that, well, Ptolemy mentions Mecca in the 2nd century, and this is simply not true.
Let's just back up a second. Why is it important for Muslims to show? Why is it important for Dawagandists to show that Mecca existed prior to the 7th century?
Well, there's several reasons that I'm going to go through.
Brilliant.
I'm going to go through it all in the slideshow. Sure. Why is this so important? And how do we compare that to other belief systems, other cultures, other civilizations? Let me just go ahead and get rolling on this. I've never claimed to be a wizard of smart. I do read a lot. I do a lot of research, and I watch a lot of YouTube videos. And the references that I use mainly for this presentation come from Dr. J. Smith's. I'm enrolled as a student, but it's not actually an actual student. It's some type of survey where I go through his courses that he presents out at Veritas University, and a lot of this material, some of this material comes from his Origins 504 class that he's currently doing. And if you ever want to get involved in getting an education on this, I would encourage you to go to Veritas University, International University out of California, and enroll in their courses, because it's just absolutely phenomenal what you learn. Also, I get this from Dan Gibson's Nabatean.net channel. Some of the information comes from his books, Early Islamic Qiblas, which I keep right back here on my shelf, keep it handy, and the other one, which is called Quranic Geography, which is also phenomenal work as far as somebody going in and researching the history of the geography as it relates to the Quran itself. And then lastly, a lot of the material today is going to come from Dr. Rafat Amari's book, Islam in Light of History. He does have a condensed article online if you want to go to that, so you don't have to read the whole book and see some of the people that he cites from history, people who were there on the ground prior to Muhammad, and see what they have to say about that region of Arabia. Now, when we think of history and applying history, we look at all kinds of different civilizations. Number one, Roman history. If we go back and we try to find, evidence for Roman history, I mean, it's not hard to find. It's right there in your face. I mean, you got the Roman Colosseum in Rome, which I've been to that place several times. It's just absolutely phenomenal. Mm-hmm. And then you have all kinds of other archaeological evidence within the surrounding areas, in not only in Italy itself, but also in the Mediterranean region, showing that there was a Roman Empire, to include places in Greece, as far as Greece. And then plus we also have writings from that talk about what happened during the Roman Empire. Of course, Josephus in his Antiquity of Jews, Tacitus, all these discuss the history of Rome. So we have the history of Rome right there in front of us. You also have Egyptian history. You have all kinds of artifacts and archaeological digs where we can find evidence for the Egyptian civilization. This has become a very popular one, this one up here in Navarre. I would encourage anybody that if you have some time to go ahead and Google that and look up the dig that they have there in Navarre. But we also have a writing from a guy by the name of Ipawar that talks about the Exodus, or what a lot of people consider relational to the Exodus. But we do have their writings that discuss events in Egyptian history. Same thing with Greece. If you go to Athens today, this is Mars Hill, taken from Mars Hill, it's the Acropolis, and you can go there all over Greece itself and find ancient ruins. As a matter of fact, these pieces of pottery here, or this archaeological evidence, was dug up in prior to 2000 when Greece was hosting the Olympics that year. They had to build all kinds of infrastructure to accommodate the Olympics, and they found all kinds of artifacts supporting the existence of a Greek civilization in the 4th century BC. And also we have literature from Greece that we can find that supports that. Even if you go east into Asia, you have all kinds of evidence from the Chinese civilizations and ancient writings there. You go to South America, into what is now Peru. Machu Picchu is one of the most famous ones down there. And you don't have a lot of writing because they had an oral tradition, but you still have all kinds of archaeological evidence from Peru, even Babylon. Now, this is kind of personal to me because I've been to Babylon. This is a picture I actually took in the city of Babylon from an ancient dig. There I am when I was a lot thinner and a lot younger. And you have all kinds of different evidences there and literature from the Babylonian Empire. And then if you go to Nineveh, which is modern day Mosul, you have this evidence here from Sennacherib. This is his castle here. You can go into actually Sennacherib from the Old Testament and see the evidence that this guy lives outside of Israel today. So why is this important? Why is it important? Because the fact of the matter is that we are given this standard Islamic narrative that Mecca was a city that all of Islam is built upon. The problem is Islam cannot compare to these types of evidences that we have for other civilizations. When we look at the evidence, there is no evidence. Let me just say this point blank, there is no evidence for the existence of a 7th century Mecca. None. You don't have any archaeological evidence for 7th century Mecca. You don't have any manuscript evidence, somebody talking about Mecca in the 7th century. You don't have any corroborating Quranic evidence where you have is explained or detailed here in Dan Gibson's Quranic Geography. He talks about how the descriptions in the Quran reference like for example, it has olive trees in the Quran. It says that Mecca has olive trees. Mecca doesn't have olive trees. It's too dry to have olive trees. That's much further north. And then also there's no cartographical evidence, meaning that there's no map evidence. The soonest, I think the soonest mention of Mecca on a map comes in the 900s. 900s. That's 300 years after the death of Muhammad. So the problem is that that Mecca itself, if we think of faith as a three-legged stool, when we think of Christianity, death, deity, resurrection, as a three-legged stool, you remove any one of those three foundational principles of Christianity, the whole thing falls. And the same thing applies to Islam. You have Muhammad, the Quran, and the city of Mecca. You take away Mecca, that whole thing just falls over, because what you're doing is you're talking about a place that is, you might as well just say it was Disneyland. So you're talking about a place that needs to be supported by evidence outside of the Quran. Now, if we think about how important Mecca is, here's what this is: the place where supposedly Adam and Eve were cast down to. You find that in chapter 2, verse 38. This is the place where Abraham and Ishmael supposedly built the Kaaba. That's in this would be 2000 BC. This would be 4,000 years ago. So we should have at least 4,000 years of archaeological evidence supporting the existence of Mecca. It's called the mother of all cities. It's the place where you had previous pagan religions, according to the Sunnah and the Sirah of Islam. This is the place where Muhammad began his prophethood. This is where you have the Hira cave, for Pete's sake. This is the place where you have hundreds of prophets who are supposedly buried there. This is according to Qurtubi. This is the place where you have 1.6 billion people bow towards 5 times a day, according to chapter 2, verse 144. This is the place where Muslims are required to go on their Hajj at least one time in their lifetime if they're physically and financially capable of doing it. Mecca is that one of those pillars, central pillars of the three-legged stool of Islam. And you take away that one leg, the whole thing falls over. You take away Mecca, you don't have Islam. And so what I have done is I've done quite a bit of extensive reading and research on this, and I have found that there is no evidence for Mecca. And the only rescuing device that Muslims that will provide is this claim that Ptolemy, a 2nd century, he was actually the curator of the Alexandrian library. He mentions it in his writings about Arabia Felix, which is the region in which Mecca lies today. So if you go to Islamic Awareness, they provide a rebuttal or a rescuing device saying that Ptolemy mentions Mecca, but he doesn't mention Mecca there. And I'm going to show why that is today. So when we look at Ptolemy, here's a Greek cartographer. He never visited Arabia. He lived in Alexandria, Egypt, and he was in charge of the Alexandrian library, which, oh, by the way, I think if we're familiar with history, or his supposed history, was burned by the 2nd Caliph of Islam in 638. Yep. He was in charge of the library for almost a quarter century, and he had access to all of the geographical works that were extant at that time. So he was able to put together, using these extant works, a accurate description, semi-accurate description of Arabia at that time. And he names dozens of different places in his works. He was also instrumental in developing the meridian type mapping system, where instead of having this is where you have a round globe and you have latitude and longitude. He helped develop that based on the locations that he knew. What is really neat about Ptolemy is that Christopher Columbus, when he was sailing the ocean blue in 1492, was using Ptolemy's calculations. And this is why he actually thought he was in India instead of the Dominican Republic. Sorry, I'm a history teacher and I had to bring that up. He also wrote a guide to geography, and in here he describes a location in Arabia with a temple, and he calls this place Makaraba. Now, Makaraba does not sound like Mecca. However, if you put the accent like I did on it, it gets pretty close. But when you talk to linguists, they say the etymology of that word and the application of the word is it's nothing close. There's also other kinds of problems with this. If you look on a map, according to Ptolemy, right here is Makaraba, right there on the map. That's where the Makaraba is supposed to be located. Now we could use Yathrib, which is Medina, as a guide to where Makaraba is on Ptolemy's map. Now, if you notice, Makaraba is east of Medina. That is very problematic. And the reason why is Mecca is west of Medina. So when you start using the longitudinal lines, north and south line, what you do is you run into a very big problem with the location of Makaraba. Now, if you also go into some of his writings, it places Makaraba further south down towards Yemen. It's like the fifth out of six cities that he lists. And so it'd be much further south than what Mecca is even today. So the bottom line is Ptolemy does not mention Mecca. He mentions a place called Makaraba, and I'm going to bring up a couple other facts about Makaraba. It's not mentioned anywhere prior to the 2nd century. So if Mecca is supposed to be a city that had existed for 6,000 years, if you use biblical calculations in the Book of Chronicles, and 6 to 10,000 years, I don't know, however you want to do it, or you want to use Abraham and Ishmael building the Kaaba there, and that goes back to 4,000 years. It's not mentioned anywhere prior to that. It's not mentioned anywhere prior to the 7th century. Now, there are other cities that he names in the region, but like I said, it's located east of Medina, and he describes 5 to 6 cities. Okay, I already said all this. So he mentions Makaraba, which is in Oman, Makroba, which is in Oman, but it never appears. There's the key thing. It never appears again in any classical survey. So this word, this name of this city, Makaraba, that Ptolemy lists in the 2nd century, doesn't show up in any other literature prior to the 2nd century or after. That is critically important. And also, all the previous surveys prior to Ptolemy do not mention the city of Mecca. Now, if we look at the biblical history, and let's just compare this to biblical, apples to oranges here, or apples to apples here. Biblical history, we know that Jerusalem existed clear back to the dating of the 11th century BC.
Sorry, Eric, just before we jump into the biblical history. So basically the Islamic argument is based entirely upon the similar sounding word of Makaraba to Mecca.
Correct. It's they call remember the phonic fallacy they talk about?
Yeah. The phonic fallacy is all over Islamic apologetics. It's all over Islamic polemics. So, for instance, they use it a lot in the Old Testament because there's a Hebrew adjective called Makmadim, and that sounds like Muhammad, so therefore it's got to be Muhammad. And it's anyone who's bilingual, and I'm bilingual, will understand the idea of the false friend. 2 words that may be pronounced identically or do not necessarily mean the same thing. And unfortunately, this phonetic fallacy is all over Islamic apologetics. It's all over Islamic polemic. So their entire argument rests solely on the sound of the word, and it ignores where Ptolemy puts the actual city, where he describes its place.
Correct. Yeah, they're relying on the font, the pronunciation of the words, and notice that that's not even how it's pronounced.
Yeah.
It's not even pronounced that way, but they use the emphasis on the Makaraba and Mecca. They try to use that sound to demonstrate the similarities between the two. But
so that's a really weak argument.
Yes.
Yes, it's a really weak argument,
Right.
but it's surprising how many people are fooled by these phonetic fallacies.
You're absolutely right. And if you go to some place where they're giving speeches, I mean, you're there every Sunday at Speaker's Corner, and they bring that up, and you have these people, you might as well just go to SeaWorld and watch the flapping seals there, because that's exactly what they're doing.
Yeah,
they're not thinking it through.
I mean, I guess the English particularly susceptible to it because we're such bad linguists, But right. I can swap from Spanish and English are 2 languages I use, and I know there are false friends between those 2 languages. So they exist elsewhere.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I lived in Panama for 4 years, and I actually also lived in Italy for 4.5 years, and the two languages are very, very similar.
Yeah.
And then anyway, I
It's
just
an
got all
important
kinds
point to make, because if their entire argument is based on a similar sound, I mean, what does that prove?
nothing.
Exactly,
It
nothing.
proves absolutely nothing. Especially if you provide a location that's not even close to where you're trying to place a city.
And am I all right? Am I all right? Just to push back a little bit on that, because like I want to push back, because I want, before I adopt this revisionist position, one of the reasons why I'm having you on, Jay on, Mel on, is before I adopt a revisionist position, I want to see how much it stands up to scrutiny. So my first question is, I don't know if you've done the research into this, but have we looked into whether Ptolemy accurately identifies cities that still exist or that we know existed, and accurately identifies where they were in Arabia?
That's a great question. And yes, the majority of the cities that Ptolemy does list have been and I'm getting to that. There's subsequent.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. They are subsequently proven to have existed. For example, Yathrib, Medina. He names Medina. Well, everybody knows that Medina existed at that time. Medina had existed clear back into I think it's like the 2nd or 3rd century BC. So we know that these other locations that Ptolemy places or mentions and then places on his map existed at that time.
And are they accurate where he places them?
Not entirely, and the reason why is because he's using a map that is like 28% smaller than, or his scale is about 28% smaller than what the world actually is. So he was off in its placement, but also if you expand that out, Dan Gibson does a really good job of showing that it actually moves Macaroba further away from Mecca and not closer. It moves it towards a river further north. So it doesn't help if you start using the accurate calculations and making an application. It doesn't help the Islamic argument at all. It actually hurts it.
I wonder. I mean, I'm just thinking aloud here. I wonder if Macaroba is possibly some kind of cultural memory of the people that lived in the Arabian Peninsula that's gone down through the generations, that it was some kind of ancient pagan temple, and then at some point Mecca is built almost, I don't know, maybe Mecca is built to establish it. Like that's a thought.
Well, we could get into, how I believe it's been redacted upon Islamic history as developed by the Abbasids. This is where I think it came from, but that I can't, you can't prove it. And when you can't prove something, then everybody wants to pounce on you. But the theory itself is consistent in its sound, but you can't demonstrate 100% that the Abbasids did redact Mecca back upon their history and all of the subsequent ahadith literature that came in the Sirah that was written 200 years after the fact, or at least the copy that we have today is written 200 years after the fact. You can't demonstrate that, or you cannot prove it conclusively, but you can clearly demonstrate that there has been a redaction at some point in time. And the reason why I say that is because of Dan Gibson's work. If you look at Dan Gibson's work, as far as the Qibla question is concerned, all of the 1st century AH Qiblas, the first within 100 years of Muhammad, don't face Mecca. They face further north, whether it's Petra. You can say they face Petra. They face somewhere in between. Some of them, you might make the argument that some of them face Jerusalem, but they definitely do not face Mecca. So you can say, okay, well, this change in the Qibla did not come from the Quran. It came from the Abbasids. The Abbasids changed the direction to make it uniform. I think the earliest Qibla that they have found using archaeological evidence is dated to like 727 or somewhere around there, where there was a mosque that was built in 727 that finally faces Mecca. It's almost 100 years after the death of Muhammad. How is that possible?
Yeah. I mean, these guys navigated the deserts by stars. You'd think they'd be able to build a wall in the right direction.
Yeah,
You know,
you would hope
if they can point a camel's nose in the right direction, you reckon they'd get the whole face of a wall going in the right direction.
Well, you would hope so, especially when their life depended upon it. I mean, to know which direction they were going.
Right. So, I mean, I've got other thoughts about this that I might come back to, like the thought that perhaps Makaraba was lost. But then also, if Makaraba is an entirely different place, then the question is, where is it? Like, where is it now? These are thoughts that come to my mind. But I don't want to hold up your presentation any further. So please do press on.
Okay, so we were talking about the biblical history of this. When we start talking about the archaeological proofs or artifacts that have been discovered, clearly demonstrate the accuracy of the history that we find within the Bible itself. When we look at the Jewish scribes, and we also look at the descriptions of different places within the Bible itself, they're accurate. They existed at the time, and we have archaeological evidence and artifacts that demonstrate that. No one doubts to describe the places of the specific mountains or places of worship that exist at the time. We go there and they dig them up, and there they are. Nobody talks about the geography. As when we talk about Luke being a first-rate historian, describes the geography very concisely. 600 years prior to Muhammad. And then let's go ahead and look at what these other writers and cartographers have to say about Mecca. And I'm just going to, do a, what do we call that, where you tell somebody this is something, the killer.
The knockout blow. The knockout
punch. No, it's where you tell somebody the end of the book or the end of the movie. What's that phrase that we use? Spoiler alert. There we go. Spoiler alert. Here's the spoiler alert. There is none of the earliest cartographers, none of the earliest writers demonstrate Mecca. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of these. When we start looking at a guy by the name of Hieron, he was an explorer for Alexander the Great. This is 4th century BC. And he's the third of the explorers, and he goes around the coastline of Arabia. Because I believe Alexander wanted to attack Egypt at this time. So he's trying to find a route using an all-water route there to get to Egypt, but he has to be able to supply his soldiers. So he sends this guy up the Red Sea. Now, the Red Sea, of course, runs up the western coast of Arabia. And one of the notes that he writes down in his writings is that there are no inhabitants in that region. He says there's no way that you could harbor a fleet there. And what it's corroborated later by other Greek explorers that say that the place is, this is the key thing, uninhabitable. Now, if a region is uninhabitable, and Jay Smith does a really good job of knocking that down concisely. Because what he says, okay, if you think of Mecca does not have water, and it doesn't. You have the Zamzam well. The Zamzam well, it doesn't provide enough water to do diddly squat, and it doesn't have any water, most certainly, to grow plants for people to eat. And if you don't have people there, then you don't have cities. If you don't have cities, you don't have civilizations. If you don't have a civilization, you don't have a history. So he uses the issue of water to show concisely why Mecca did not exist in the 7th century. Then you have a guy by the name of I wrote down how to pronounce this, Theophrastus, his survey. He was a classical writer in the 4th century BC, and we have writings from him. He wrote about the Sabians, which is a known civilization at the time. And he talked about their trade and the routes that they traveled. And he wrote in detail about the region, provided descriptions of places that we know existed at the time and still exist today. And he never once, of course, mentions Mecca. There's nothing out there. And this demonstrates Mecca was not part of the Arabian trade, as we're told in, I think it's... Montgomery Watts is supposed to be the guy that talked about the Meccan trade and how they went across the land. But in order to do that, you got to come 1,000 feet off of the plateau just to get down to Mecca. And it's not part of the Meccan trade, or not part of the Arabian trade route. So this, if it was, somebody would have mentioned it. But the problem is nobody does. So if you think about this, this guy is supposed to specialize in writing details about the geography of the area, and he just happens to leave an entire city out. How does that possibly happen? Well, he might have left it out because it didn't exist. Now, this guy has a tricky name, Eratosthenes. Eratosthenes. There you go. Tos. It's the Tos, not Tass. Tos.
Eratosthenes.
Right. And he lives in the second and third centuries BC. And he also documents the geography of Arabia. And what they're trying to do at this time, the Greeks are trying to control the spice trade that goes from India into Yemen. And he starts measuring out the length of the Red Sea in order to determine how long it would take for a boat to travel up and down the coastline. And his survey has all of the marine routes to include the Gulf of Aqaba, which goes further north all the way up into where Eilat is located today in southern Israel. So he documents all of this area from the southern part of the Red Sea all the way up through the Gulf of Aqaba. And he talks about people and the places where they're located in that entire region. But the place where Mecca is supposed to be, he describes as being uninhabitable. Now, if people did live there, then it wouldn't be uninhabitable. But people didn't live there, and he doesn't describe it as a city because the city simply does not exist. And when we talk about the villages, there's no villages or the cities in that region that are described by previous explorers either. So he's not adding anything new. He's just continuing to express what had previously come before him, which was the region. There's nothing there, and the region itself is uninhabitable. And when we think about this, if this is supposed to be a place where people made pilgrimages to, even if they was under, using pagan religions, because remember, the Quran says that this city was created, or the Kaaba was built by Abraham and Ishmael, and that's 1900 BC. That's just, you would have some type of evidence for people traveling there if that was the case. The problem is, again, I'll say it again, there is no evidence. Just like in Israel today, if you go into Israel today, they have ancient writings where people would scribble on the side of a rock, talking about their pilgrimages and talking about their journeys to Jerusalem, to the house of the Lord. You don't have those similar rock inscriptions in Islam.
And that's particularly important because Muslims love to quote, I think it's Psalm 189 or 183, and it's like, oh, the valley of Baca. Oh, look, and because Baca is mentioned in the Quran, well, they're the two same words, so they've got to be the same place.
Yes.
And it's like, no, my friend, no. At so many levels, no. But it's that false friend logic again. And if there was this pilgrimage of Jewish people coming up through the Baca Valley, through the Meccan Valley, you would find evidence of their pilgrimage through that. You'd find them, in a similar way, writing on the stone, look, I am Aaron traveling up to Jerusalem to go to make my sacrifice to the Lord. But none of that exists. And I just thought that's worth mentioning. That there's
it's absolutely true, because when we start trying to identify, if this is a place where people made pilgrimages, then and if this is something that you are going to assert, then you have to provide some type of evidence for it, and they don't. And I appreciate you bringing that psalm up where it mentions the Valley of Baca, because I've engaged people on that, and I said, well, if you read the entire verse, it also talks about Baca having pools of water in it.
Yeah.
Have you been to Mecca and seen these pools of water? Oh, no, it does not exist, and it doesn't line up. But again, the phonic fallacy. This sounds something like is in the Bible, so we're going to use it as some type of rescuing device for Islam, and it simply does not meet any type of critique of it. If you're going to provide a critical analysis of something, it just does not meet that standard.
Two words that sound the same is not evidence of something's existence.
No, it is not. Now, notice the one thing about Eratosthenes is that he does not mention Mecca, and he actually followed this land route himself. He was actually the one that when he actually was there. And if somebody is there and they follow this route and he doesn't mention it, it's not there. When you talk about the death nail for the existence of a 20th century BC Mecca, this is it right here. You have a guy that was there and he says that this land is uninhabitable. There's nothing here. What can you say? Well, he just missed it. No. And I'm going to show you here in a couple slides, a guy by the name of Strabo definitely provides evidence that this place did not exist. Okay, and then Agatharchides or Agatharchides, depending on who you talk to and how you pronounce them. There's actually one of them that's in here that they give you a British accent and they give you an American accent.
Is he Greek? Is this guy Greek?
Yeah, Agatharchides.
So it would be Ayatharcides. I would guess. Because the G's pronounced like a Y.
Okay, well
so
then
I'm gonna go with Ayatharcides. Sounds okay. Greek.
Okay, well the one that I have is Agatharchides. The CH is a K sound.
CH is a K, so that would be
Agatharchides.
Agatharchides. Oh, yeah. Let's just go with Agatharchides.
Right. Here in America, we say Agatharchides.
Yeah.
And that's, even though that's probably not an accurate rendering of the name, but we know who we're talking about. And okay, so this guy, he lives in Alexandria, Egypt. He has access to the Alexandrian library, the same one that Ptolemy, one that predates Ptolemy by 2 centuries, I think. And he is one of the most important geographers at the time. And he's very close to the royalty that existed in Alexandria at that time. And he's going to have knowledge of these expeditions. Now, I think where Alexandria is, he's going to have knowledge of the expeditions that have made down along the Red Sea. He's going to have this access to these maps. And again, all of these people that Ptolemy had access to, Agatharchides also has access to their writings. And when he starts talking about the writings, of people, he refers to them as being eyewitnesses to the region. And when we start looking for first-person testimony, I mean, this is how history is done. When you have primary source literature, you can, in a lot of ways, you can trust that much easier than secondary sources or tertiary sources. So he classifies a lot of these writers as being primary sources because why? They were there. And when we look, and here, look at this part right here. It says when we look at the discoveries, these are confirmed. What he writes about, these are confirmed in the 7th and 8th centuries. So his writings are very accurate as far as naming the cities. And he also provided measurements of the land along the Red Sea in Western Arabia. And that's very important in order to calculate distances and the locations of different places in that region. And of course, knowing the distances, when you start planning trade routes, you're going to have to figure out, okay, well, how long is it going to take for the boat to get from point A to point B? How much water, how much food do you need in order to get from point A to point B? So it's essential to know the distances. And this is what he came up with. And then he also talks about the Nabateans. The Nabateans were some of the most prominent traders in the region at that time and for centuries afterwards also. And he lists all kinds of places along the Red Seas. And he talks about temples, which was very important to Greeks because Greeks were a very polytheistic type culture. And so when you start talking about the building of temples, the Greeks are going to be very interested in that. But the one thing that Agatharchides leaves out is what? He leaves out Mecca. He does not mention Mecca at all. Oh, I just mentioned that temples were of great interest to the Greeks. And he lists all kinds of tribes that are living along the Red Sea. But again, never once mentions Mecca. Now, he would be very interested if Mecca, now think about this. Here's a guy that he's Greek, and he's going to be describing all of these locations along the Red Sea, and he's going to be describing prominent places of worship. Wouldn't it be logical to be thinking that, okay, so this guy is interested in naming places of religious worship to name Mecca, if Mecca was indeed supposed to be this location where all kinds of Arabian tribes made pilgrimage to in order to worship. He would have mentioned it. But the fact is that he doesn't. And he also, this is important, he describes his land as being uninhabitable. And if you have people describing the land as being uninhabitable, how can you have an entire civilization grow up out of that region? A lot of those people at that time, as we know, were nomadic. And here, this is a folio of some of the locations named by Agathar's guides, and how they mentioned up here. You got the Nabateans. This is I can't even pronounce that. The Banazamanes or something like that. They're mentioned by Diodorus, and this is another. And I'll get to him here in a second. That's another rescuing device of Muslims saying, well, Diodorus mentions the place where all the Arabs went as far as a place of worship. Yeah, but he's like 600 miles away. So no, that doesn't work. That doesn't work out either. Okay, yeah, here's Diodorus. He's wrote in the 1st century BC. He writes a 40-volume book called Bibliotheca Historica. Now, you have to be very concise, let's just put it that way, in order to write 40 volumes talking about history. And he talks about a temple that all of the Arabs came to. And here's the name of it. Let me go back here. Here's the tribe right here where they're located, right up here. Notice Mecca's down here. So there's 600 miles off from where this tribe is. And this is, again, an Islamic rescuing device by the Dawaganda, saying, well, this is the place where all the Arabs came. Look at Diodorus writes about this. Yeah, but he writes about it in a completely different locations.
Okay, so because he actually says in the land of the Bani Zomenes.
Correct. Yes. So he describes this land because there are other tribes that traded with these people. And when these people talk about, well, we were trading with these Bani Zomenes, it sounds like it's a bunch of zombies, but it's not. Yeah. When we're trading with them, they describe the locations, and the location is much further north.
Is that the Gulf of Aqaba?
Yes. Well, it's just south of the Gulf of Aqaba. Let me bring that up. Here's the Gulf of Aqaba. So it's just right here on the southern tip of it.
Yeah. Even if we were generous and gave them a 300-mile radius, which would be really ridiculous, but let's just be generous and say we gave them 300 miles to travel to this temple, that would still fall far short of where Mecca would be in relation to where that is.
Yeah, absolutely. And even to give them that, though, you still have to, water is the key.
Yeah.
If you give them that amount, that's a huge distance to travel in the middle of a desert.
Yeah.
And how you do that is, I don't know.
Well, there's a point. I mean, the point is that people don't build their temples that far away from their civilizations and settlements.
No,
don't go out of your way. You find temples where people are. You don't find temples and then people. People build their temples where they are. The religious events happen where they are, and you don't go out of your way to build a temple some way over there.
No, you're right.
When settlements are over here.
Well, that would be the equivalent of me saying, okay, well, we're going to build a temple down in Texas, and we're going to make a pilgrimage there every single year, and then come clear back. No, you're absolutely right.
And the other side of that is wherever there's a pilgrimage place, a settlement develops. So if this was an ancient temple that people were going to go and visit, and let's pretend for a second it really was Mecca, then that would have led to a settlement in Mecca. It would have led to people trying. So there would have been a city there. There would have been a town there already for people to find and for it to appear on the maps.
Well, one of the things when I was reading about this, one of the reasons why they would build temples is they're walking around the desert and if they find a meteor, they build a temple around it.
Yeah.
So, even when we could say that, okay, well, they're going to only build these temples around the places that they inhabit. Well, the places when they inhabit is where they're going to find a meteor. If they don't, if it's inhabitable, you're not going to find a meteor out there. Why? Because nobody's out there looking for them or stumbling upon them. So it just makes sense that when you have a you have to have a civilization in order for, like you were just saying, you have to have a civilization in order for people to make a pilgrimage to.
Yep.
And in order for that civilization to exist, you have to have water, which produces food, which produces people, which produces cities, which produces the civilization and history. And you don't have that in Mecca. This is why I go with the theory that Mecca was redacted upon the Islamic literature, the Hadith literature in the Sirah.
Yeah, and is it Dan Gibson? No, who's the historian who wrote In the Shadow of the Sword or In the Shadow of...
Tom Holland.
Tom Holland. I think it was
Yes.
Tom Holland that observed that one of the wives of, I think, the second caliph, or one of the wives after the Islamic Empire had been founded, built aqueducts to Mecca.
Yes, this is true.
Aqueducts. Huge aqueducts to Mecca, which indicates there was no available water in that place. Because why would you build an aqueduct to transport water to somewhere that's got these giant pools of water?
And that are necessary in order to maintain a city. And
exactly.
They don't, and so they can't have a city if you don't have water. If you go to Jay Smith's channel, he does a video. I can't remember when he put this up, but he does a video of how Mecca gets its water today, and how they have all these desalination plants down in Jeddah, pumping it in these huge containers. He describes them as being the world's largest containers, and that includes oil containers. This is water containers to provide Mecca with the necessary water to water 4 million. Yeah, 4 million. Well, it has 2 million people, I think, that live in the city today, and then you have an additional 2 million, 2.5 million that come there every year for the Hajj.
And that's my point: is that any place where there's a temple that ends up being a city.
Yeah, well, I don't know if any place that there's going to be a city there.
Well, not a city, a settlement, let's say.
There would be some type of settlement, or maybe a village there. You would have a minimal to maintain the temple itself, but you wouldn't have to have a civilization or some type of huge city there. Okay, so Diodorus. Let's. I think I skipped ahead here. Here we are. Okay, so here again is another Greek historian. He writes in the first century BC. We already went through this? We did went through it. Okay, so he also there's also people that believe that Muhammad worshipped at a temple when he went to Tabuk, and this location of Tabuk is confirmed by Agatharchides. And when we look on a map, I think I have a map coming up here. Yeah, here we are. Oh yeah, Nanosus in 530. This location of Tabuk is mentioned, but again, in Diodorus's writings, there's no mention of a temple in Tabuk. Look where it is. It's clear up here, west of the Gulf of Aqaba. Look how far. I mean, Mecca's down here, and so you're talking about a 500 mile, 400 mile distance. It's like taking some of the anachronisms that we find in the Quran and saying, okay, look, you have a Sumerian help build the golden calf at Mount Sinai, and that's what 1450 BC, and Samaria does not become a distinct region in Israel until 721 when the Assyrian Empire carries off the northern kingdom. So this is, again, you start saying, okay, this would be an anachronistic type of allusion to the geographical problems that we face here. Okay, Artemidorus. I think it's supposed to be Artemidorus. So the Americans T is I think they pronounce the Artemidorus or Artemidorus in England. I actually looked up the English pronunciations for these. I might be wrong on that. I don't want to get your audience, but in America we say Artemidorus.
Right.
So we say Artemidorus. The survey here again is a Greek geographer who writes in the 1st century of BC, and he has information from not all, but most previous geographers from that region, and he uses his own personal observations in his writings, and he talks about strips of land along the Red Sea, and he talks about their populations. And he talks also about several places that are uninhabited islands along the coast. And what he makes clear was Mecca, where it sits now, that region is uninhabitable in 103 BC. Now, this is important. Of course, at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that Mecca is supposed to be a city that had existed since Adam and Eve. Or if you want to, mythologize Adam and Eve, or however you want to approach that, you can say, okay, well, it's supposedly supposed to be existent at the time of a historical figure in the Quran, which is Abraham, and that's 2000 BC. Well, here you have 100 BC, and it's saying that this region is uninhabited. You have another historian, and you have another geographer, somebody that is describing the land there, talking about it being uninhabited. Now, when you start comparing all of these people that I'm mentioning, I'm going to mention a couple more because I don't want to put your audience to sleep, Bob. But when you start mentioning when we start talking about the preponderance of the evidence against the existence of Mecca, it's not even the preponderance where you only have to have 51%. This is the overwhelming majority, the absolute 100% of the evidence that we do have demonstrates that Mecca did not exist when it claims to have existed. Again, you take away Muhammad, you have no Islam. You take away the Quran, you have no Islam. You take away Mecca, you have no Islam. And all of the evidence that we have takes away Mecca. It did not exist at that time. Now, this is one of those death nails in their coffin. Strabo's survey. Here you have a Roman geographer from the 1st century AD. Now, he is following this guy, Gallus. Now, Gallus was sent by the Roman emperor at the time to conquer Yemen because he wants to take control of the spice trade. So he sends these guys down the Arabian Peninsula, the west coast of the Arabian Peninsula, to conquer Yemen. And along the way, if you ever traveled with an army, you will know that armies at that time foraged for food. They foraged for water, the provisions to feed that army. So they are going to be identifying, and this is what Strabo did, is he was identifying all of those villages and towns that were along this way in order to support the Roman army as it goes to Yemen. And they got desperate. And this is the thing. They went 100 miles inland. Mecca sits about 40 miles inland from Jeddah. These guys went 100 miles in. And guess
from
what?
the coastline.
From the coastline, yeah.
Because wasn't this expedition partially supported by the Navy?
If it is, I did not see anything that Strabo wrote about that, and I was not. I was, when I was scanning through that, I didn't. It
might be me that's wrong.
You would probably think that they were in a way, but then again, if you don't control the Red Sea and you're going to take over the spice trade, maybe the Yemenis. I'm not sure if the Yemenis had some type of a navy that was stronger than the Roman presidents in the Red Sea.
They marched down the coast and then they foraged inland.
Yes,
didn't they?
That's
the main thing. Let's not get caught up with the naval thing. I thought they, but that could just be.
Well, you would think that they would be supported at least in some part by the Navy, and based on the desperation that this expedition had. I mean, it ended up in failure. I mean, and a lot of these men actually starved to death, and they died from dehydration and heat exhaustion. But he talks about 3 stations that were built by the Nabateans. So here he's describing the Nabatean trade route in depth in his writings. And when you get to, I'll send you this slideshow if you want me to. And if anybody else wants a copy of the slideshow, just let me know and I'll send it. Just you can email me, and I have kind of a provocative email address. It's Eric the Thecapher. I call it Eric Thecapher. And there's a reason for that. There's about 5-year history on that. People used to call me a Kafir all the time on a radio show. Said, "Oh, you want to call me a Kafir? Okay, that's my new name." Anyway, Eric Thecapher at gmail.com, and I'll be more than happy to email you this slideshow. I'm a firm believer in sharing sharing the truth than keeping it to myself. Okay, so you think about this. So here you have an army that's traveling. An army would not have missed a village. They would have been accessing every single village along the way in order to plunder, at a minimum, to feed their soldiers. And the army was dying of starvation. So they would have been desperate to find some place that would be able to provide them provisions. And so when they're searching all these villages or these towns along the way, they would be asking them, do you know of any other village that is within this region? And if they did and they didn't tell them, well, they would probably kill them. So under the pain of death, people were probably giving up the neighboring towns and cities around them in order to provide provisions for this army. And you even have Dio Cassius mentions the privation of this expedition. He mentions that how they starved to death. And now this was Gallus was I can't remember how he describes Gallus, but it's not very kind the way that he mentions this. But again, he mentions Strabo is mentioning all these other famous geographers and citing their works, using their works as a means in order to navigate the west coast of Arabia. And again, here he's mentioning all these other known villages that existed in and around Mecca, or that region anyway, because there was no villages that existed around Mecca because it was uninhabitable. But he was mentioning all these other places. Now, I'm not sure if it was him or somebody else mentions actually the Arab tribes of that region, the Bedouin tribes that were nomadic and traveled. It's not Strabo, though. Okay, notice one thing here. He does not mention Mecca either. No mention by Strabo of Mecca. Somebody that was on the ground in the 1st century does not mention a city that has supposedly existed for at least, well, up to that time, 2,000 years. And if you want to go with the analogy of Adam and Eve, how far back do you want to go? 6,000, 8,000, 10,000? It did not exist.
And he doesn't even mention a temple.
No. He mentions that the region was uninhabited. Because
one of the sort of fallback positions that I can see emerging out of this criticism is that Muslim apologists simply revise their history to say, yeah, it's not a city. We never said it was a city. No, you totally misunderstood us. We never mentioned it was a city. That was just you. What we meant is it's just the Kaaba. It's just the temple Kaaba.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of
I can see that being their fallback position. It was never a city. It was just a tiny little temple.
Yeah, well, they're going to have to prove it, and I'm going to show why they can't today. Go ahead.
Right, just before you do that, because is this the route that the Roman expedition took?
Yes.
Or imagined? We imagined that.
This is according to his writings. This is a folio that's been developed describing the route that Gallus took.
Because I debated a guy called Obi at Speaker's Corner, and I tried to mention this very expedition, and Obi was saying that no, they never got all the way, they never got as far south as Mecca. And I was trying to point out to them, no, they got all the way into Yemen. They got all the way to the south of the peninsula. And is that correct? Is that what you're about to confirm?
That's my understanding. They got all the way down.
Exactly. The Roman expedition gets all the way into the south of the Arabian Peninsula, thus demonstrating the fact that if there was a Mecca to be found, they would have found it. If there was a valley of Baca with pools of water, they would have found it. But they didn't. Do you get that, Obi? I hope you're listening. They didn't, my friend. History contradicts you. Sorry, I just had to do that.
No, well, I mean, if
he wasn't listening to history.
Well, this is one of those peculiar things when you start applying the historical method to a lot of what Islam is. I mean, it does not hold any water, and this is removing that third leg of Islam, and completely the whole thing just falls over. Because if you don't have a Mecca, you don't have a historical Muhammad. You don't have a Muhammad you can't have a Muhammad living in a city that doesn't exist.
Because the thing is, and as you've quite rightly pointed out, if this army is in such privation, they're going to be scouring hard to find water. They're going to be scouring hard to find food. And if there was a Mecca to be found, they would have found it. And
they would have been forced. They would have been going mad to find.
Yeah, they would have conquered any inhabitable place, because any inhabitable place would have had food. And if they didn't conquer a place, it's because it wasn't there to be conquered, or because there was no food there to be had.
And if you're in another location, and you want this army to leave you alone, you're going to give up your neighbor. Say, look, there's Mecca right over, down. If you go down, come off the plateau 1,000 feet, you go down to Mecca. They have all kinds of food down there.
Exactly. I mean, for me, that bit's neither here nor there, because the Romans would have scoured for it anyway, regardless of whatever reports or intelligence they would have received.
Well, you would that would provide a motivation for people to name the other places in and around their location. So they would give the army hope that they could find other provisions. They wouldn't take everything that they had. They would leave at least something and say, look, there's this town over here, Mecca. They're going to have provisions too. So if you go over there and not take everything that I'm giving you them, you can take whatever you want from them, but just don't take everything that we have.
Yep. I can see how that works. But my point is, for all of you that are watching this, is an entire army marched from north to south, Arabian Peninsula, down the coastline, where Mecca would have been, and they were foraging, and they never found a place called Mecca in the 1st century. And for me, this is what convinces me. This is actually what convinced me personally that Mecca certainly wasn't around BC. Or even 1st century AD.
Well, if you look at Dr. Amari's position, he says that Mecca did not exist all the way up to the 4th century. So he even provides a 2-century window for the existence of Mecca in his book. But even with that, the evidence for that is non-existent, and I'm going to talk about that in just a moment.
Okie dokie. Yeah, I'll let you press on that. I've made my point, Obi. You can see the map.
Okay, now this document, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, this is supposed to be the most reliable document on trade routes in the regions of Arabia. And this, again, is a 1st century document. We don't know who the name of the author was, but the document itself is really not important, because the document itself is demonstrably accurate. Based on the locations, the places, and the distances that it names. We know that he lived in the city of Lucine Come. By the details, he provides very accurate details of the city. So it appears to be a merchant that traveled the regions of Arabia and was engaged in the spice trade with India. And again, he's very familiar in this document. When we look at this document, he's very familiar with the central tract of Arabia. And again, this book is corroborated by several geographical and historical evidences, places that we can go to today and demonstrate that they existed in the 1st century, according to this book. And that's the important thing to understand. And again, he goes hundreds of miles in from the Red Sea, and he does not name Mecca. Now, if this is supposed to be the most historically accurate document mapping the west coast of Arabia, going in 100 miles from the west coast of the Red Sea, and Mecca is not mentioned, then this means that Mecca did not exist. So when we look at the plethora of different authors that we have here, I got one more. I'm sorry. I got one more. Almost done here. Sorry. All of them saying that, number one, not all of them, but the majority of them saying that, number one, the land is inhabitable, but none of them mentioning the city of Mecca. You just might get a hint here. We call this a clue that Mecca did not exist. If you have nobody mentioning it, then it's probably not there. I could go down to, let's say we were in Tampa yesterday, or day before yesterday. And I'd say, well, we went to Disneyland while we were in Tampa. People will go, well, wait a second. Disneyland's not in Tampa. It's on the other side of the state. It's in Orlando. So how can you have gone to Disneyland? Again, here you have people naming locations or failing to name a location that wasn't there. Or if they're failing to, let me back up here. I'm confusing myself. I do that sometimes in my old age. If you're not mentioning the location of a city, and I'm not talking about just one or two of them. I'm talking about all of them, all of the cartographers, geographers, and people who wrote on that region at that time. do not mention Mecca. And then you're going to insist that it existed for 4,000 years. The responsibility to demonstrate that is on you, because what you are doing is you're coming up with a narrative that contradicts all the evidence that we do have. And it just wasn't this document. Okay, let's see. Okay. So yeah, this is okay. Here's some of the details that I mentioned. Let's see here. Where am I? Okay, so here you have, he mentions the cities that were of little importance at that time. He mentions the names of their tribes and their kings. This is important stuff, because this is where you get down in the details. It's kind of like the Quran that doesn't have hardly any details to it. Here you start having details. You not only have the details of the locations of the places, the names of the places, the names of the tribes that live there, but also he's dropping names of the people who ruled that region. And look at here, he describes in detail all of the regions surrounding Mecca. He's talking about that region around Mecca, and he's not mentioning Mecca. So how can you describe the entire region around Mecca and not mention the most important place within that region itself? Again, you have...
Especially since the Muslim apologists are quoting Ptolemy and the other guy who talked about the Byzomines temple. Right. And they're saying that that's Mecca. So right. Here, if the apologists are right in naming those two other places and saying that that's Mecca, and the apologists are right when they quote Psalm, I think 183 or 189, and it says the Baca Valley, and that's meant to be Mecca. Well, all of these cartographers should also be mentioning Mecca as well, or at least a good number of them, if not all, maybe even if just 40% of them did.
That would be making sense. That would be the most logical assumption somebody could make.
But they don't.
Right.
That means, but they don't, and that means all they're doing is going, oh well, these two words sound the same, so It must be Mecca.
Yeah, and that's again the phonic fallacy of Makaraba. Okay, so again, you don't have Mecca being mentioned, but no, look at all the trade routes that is described in this work. It goes as far east. It goes far east as India, because why? They were engaged in the spice trade. Now we have Pliny the Elder, who lives again in the 1st century, and he writes the book of Natural History in 77 AD. And when we look at a book that describes the culture or the life of an average Roman citizen and things that occurred, this would be like a history book of the United States. And this is what Pliny provides. And look he describes 92 tribes and nations in Arabia, 92 separate tribes and locations within Arabia itself. And not once does he mention Mecca. So again, we go back to, and I know we're sounding like a broken record here, and I'm sorry if this is boring your audience, but the fact of the matter is all the people that wrote about that region, describes the region, don't mention Mecca. And if they're not mentioned there, if it's not mentioned in the ancient literature, how can you condescend to somebody and say, well, we know Mecca existed? Why? Because it's in the Hadith literature, it's in the Sirah. Again. Yep. The sensible thing would be take the approach and say, well, look, the Hadith literature was not compiled until, was it 870? Bukhari was the first compiler. 870, that's 240 years after the death of Muhammad. 2.5 centuries before they start compiling all of these
stories.
Exactly, that's exactly what they were. It's just stories. Or the Sirah was not written down, or it's not, at least the Sirah that we have now. Years. Well, right. You have Ibn Ishaq was 100 years after the death of Muhammad, and then you have Ibn Hisham, who got rid of a lot of Ishaq's information.
Yeah, because we don't have anything by Ibn Hishaq. It's all through Ibn Hisham.
Right. Yeah, Hisham edited it, and so to say that, well, we have this evidence here. No, you don't. That the fact of the matter is you don't have this evidence.
But more importantly, the fact that all other historians don't mention, all these other map makers, geographers, cartographers, historians, whatever we want to call them, aren't mentioning Mecca, means that when Muslims are jumping on Ptolemy and the other guy that you mentioned, Agatharchides, and they try to use them and the Psalm 183 mentioned in the Back Valley as proof of Mecca's previous existence, it means that they are misreading those documents. Because if they were reading those documents correctly, then all these other historians would also be mentioning it as well. And especially the ones that did in-depth research for whatever reason, whether because of trade or whether because of invasion, they would have mentioned it, and they didn't. So that means that it's the Muslim apologists abusing the evidence, not proving their position.
Right. What they're doing is they're imposing, again, they're redacting their history upon what the actual history tells us.
Yes.
People who wrote from an unbiased position of, what purpose would somebody have to leave Mecca off of a map? You don't have Mecca on any maps until the 9th century. It's not mentioned anywhere until the 8th century. Well, why? What is the motivation for that? There is no motivation to do that. They didn't have Islamophobes in the 7th century or prior to that to keep this type of stuff from getting out into the public domain. There was no motivation there. So to try to say that, this is intentionally repressed it's absolutely absurd.
Yeah.
Again, so we're going to close out with Pliny here, and then I got a concluding slides. We're almost done. Okay, so when we look at the tribes that he mentions, these are accurate descriptions of the tribes, and these are the Bedouin peoples that inhabited that region. Again, here you have another author. Here you have another scholar that is writing about this locations, but he does not mention Mecca. But he mentions all kinds of other locations that just have absolutely no significance or impact on the region itself. But he provides details about them, but not Mecca. Some places important as Mecca, some place that people were making pilgrimages to. He's not going to mention that, but he's going to mention all these other places. That just does not make any sense at all. So when we look at Pliny the Younger's Pliny the Elder's map here. This is some of the locations that he mentions in Arabia. Okay, so what can we conclude from this? Number one, Ptolemy does not mention Mecca. That is the first and foremost thing that we need to point out here, because Ptolemy is used as this rescuing device, this apologetic to defend the existence of Mecca. Ptolemy does not mention Mecca. He mentions a city called Makaraba. Makaraba doesn't even sound like Mecca if you pronounce it correctly. But importantly, Ptolemy locates Makaraba east of a known location, which is Yathrib, when in Mecca in reality is west of Mecca. So that is a death nail in their apologetic. Like I said, he places it east. And when we look at all of the sources and people that are considered to be authoritative at that time, do not mention Mecca at all. Nobody mentions Mecca. Nobody. When I say nobody, that means
nobody.
Nobody, right. Nobody mentions it. And when we look at the motivations for writing these documents, these people are waging war. These people are trying to rule over entire regions. These people are trying to make money off of known locations. They had a motivation to accurately describe and map out that region. And you're going to try to say, well, they left it out because they didn't know, or whatever reason you're going to come up with. It's not going to hold any water, because there were military reasons, political reasons, and also economic reasons to identify Mecca, someplace as important as Mecca, where people would travel. I don't know how often they're supposed to make the pilgrimage, maybe once a year. And you're not going to include that in any of your writings, any of your cartography? Really? And you want me to believe that when none of it appears on anything? So when we look at also, I'm going to show you a video here, if you don't mind. There's no archaeological evidence for Mecca. And when I say the archaeological evidence, and the purpose of this video, it's from aerial photos from Google Maps that covers the last 20-year period. And whenever, like I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, Greece, when they hosted the Olympics in the year 2000, they had to go through massive building upgrades for their subway, for the stadiums and things of this nature. And when they dug down into the earth, they uncovered all kinds of artifacts. And this is what people might not know, but they found so many artifacts. Think about this. They found so many artifacts that they ran out of museum space to put these artifacts. So what they did was, ingeniously, they built these display cases in the subway systems themselves and displayed all the artifacts that were dug up from those specific locations. So when we look at Mecca going through this, and I'm fairly certain you've seen these massive building projects that's going on in Mecca today. Again, if you're going to build all of these high-rise built apartments or hotels or whatever, you're going to dig down into the soil. And when you dig down, if this is in fact a 4,000-year-old city, you would expect to find artifacts. If this is supposed, you would actually have to find artifacts,
especially pottery. Lots and lots of pottery.
Yes. Okay, so let's see here. Did Ptolemy build Mecca? That's an MP4, MP3. Here we are. Okay, so let me see if I can get this to come up. I'm going to bring this. Whoa, hold on. Okay, can you see this, Bob?
I can see that, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to turn down because you have.
So this is 2006.
Yes. 2003.
2003, sir.
So right here, can you see my? I can't.
Oh yeah, 2003 to 2021. Got
yeah.
you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So you have the Kaaba right here, Safa and Marwa. So the running in between the two valleys is now air conditioned, so you don't have to break a sweat when you're traveling in between Safa and Marwa.
Yeah.
And then notice what happens around the city itself. Okay. There, I turned that. Could you hear that music playing?
Yeah.
Okay. Now look at all the building that's going on around there. Look at all this.
You would find lots because those are tall buildings. You got to dig deep down to hit rock to build a building on, which means you're going to be pulling up all kinds of artifacts like you do everywhere else when you're digging around, like they do in London, like they do in Athens.
We do here in
Jerusalem.
We do here in the United States. We find Indian pottery,
artifacts.
Artifacts. Arrowheads. That used to be a favorite pastime of me when I was a kid. I'd go out looking for Indian arrowheads.
Nice. And the thing is, there's a museum inside Mecca that should be absolutely chock-a-block full of artifacts showing the thousands of years of history of human settlement in this valley and the thousands of years of pilgrimage, of people passing through the valley of Baca, and there's none of it.
None, exactly.
Not a drop.
Zero.
I mean, they have artifacts, but they're all like, this is probably from the late 7th century.
They don't have artifacts from Mecca itself.
They have artifacts connected to Arab Muslim conquerors, but they don't have artifacts predating Islam going back thousands of years.
Right. The earliest artifact that they have, according to Dan Gibson, is he went to an archaeological conference in Saudi Arabia. And according to Dan, the earliest artifact is from a 12th century Ottoman fort.
You're kidding.
No, that's the earliest artifact that they have. They have nothing prior to the 12th century. Nothing.
What?
Nothing.
Well, wait. Like I knew it was bad, but that even surprises me. I mean, there's got to be stuff before the Ottomans. There must be stuff before the Ottomans because, there's clearly a civilization that emerges after the Arab conquests. So there's got to be stuff before the Ottomans.
Okay, well, if it's not mentioned,
Dan Gibson, I would like you to have you on my show and answer that.
Yeah, this is the information that he gave James Smith, that they don't have the earliest artifact that they have, digging that deep into the Arabian desert to build these high-rise buildings, because you don't want these buildings falling over on top of them. So you're going to dig down deep. Yeah. You are going to find and this is what I find amazing. If I was a Muslim and I wanted to demonstrate the historicity of Mecca, I would be sifting through all of that dirt that they dug up to find these artifacts. I would be going to whatever rock pile they deposited this at and going through there meticulously trying to find something supporting the existence of my faith, because there's nothing there. Like I said, when there's nothing that we were talking at the beginning of the show, this is a black hole. There's nothing out there that I'm aware of. And I'm not, like I said, I'm not the smartest, guy in the universe, but there's nothing that I'm aware of that is archaeologically tied to a 7th century Mecca. And my understanding is the earliest artifact that we have is like a bootstrap of some sort from a 12th century Ottoman fort. That's half a millennia away from from where these events supposedly happened with
and
Muhammad.
The funny thing is, dry, arid environments are actually really good at preserving material.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's moist, wet environments where everything rots, but dry, arid environments with low humidity are places that do really well in preserving things. And this is why, for instance, most of our papyri of the New Testament is found in Egypt, because it's a dry, arid environment. Our earliest and oldest come from that part of the world. And
Dead Sea Scrolls. Look at the
Dead Sea Scrolls. Again, dry, arid environment. It helps to preserve. And if it can preserve papyri, it can preserve anything, because papyri is as fragile as it comes. It's like paper mache. So the fact that they've got zero in terms of evidence that demonstrates that Mecca was this settlement for thousands of years, then it really does hit a nail on the Islamic narrative that Mecca was this big city in the 7th century, because it clearly wasn't.
It definitely puts the ball in their court. If there's nothing there, in all of the writers that wrote prior to the 7th century do not mention Mecca. They describe the area as being inhabitable. And then when they go through this massive building project in the last 20 years and they produce no evidence, archaeological evidence, any type of artifacts whatsoever supporting the existence of a 7th century Mecca, let alone a 20th century BC Mecca, then the ball is in your court in order to demonstrate the historicity of your faith. And like again, I showed at the beginning of the presentation that we do have a history here for our faith in Christianity, and we thank God for those artifacts and being able to demonstrate that.
Just on that point, if you go to the British Museum, because as the world knows, we did a good job in helping to take everybody's stuff to look after it for them, but if you go to the British Museum, you can literally go on a Bible tour. There are people that will go with a Bible in hand, take you to an artifact and go, look, this artifact correlates to this story in the Bible, and this artifact correlates to this story in the Bible. And they take you all the way around the British Museum to all the areas to which the Bible is concerned. So, where's your counterexample, Muslims? Eric's thrown down the gauntlet to all you Muslim archaeologists. Come forward with your proofs to prove to us that the descriptions of Mecca and the idea that Mecca was this settlement for thousands of years is true. And if you can't, then stop abusing Ptolemy, stop abusing the Psalms, stop abusing Argathonicades, or however we pronounce his name is, and stop being selective in your evidence and using phonetic fallacies that just because two words sound the same or may even be the same, that therefore it must be referring to that which you're talking about, because it clearly doesn't stand up to a historical examination.
Well, and I would invite them, the Cross and the Crescent discussion group. The reason why we call it a discussion group is because these are the things that I like to discuss with Muslims. And I've had dozens of Muslims on the show, and I'll be honest, I'm very polite, very cordial, and I provide as much equal time as I possibly can based on the panel. that we have. But if you have evidence, if you do have evidence that supports the existence of Mecca in the 7th century, we do a live stream every Sunday at 4 p.m. Central Standard Time on YouTube. And if you want to come, I will send you just email me at erictheckefer@gmail.com, and I will be more than happy to welcome you onto the show so you can present the evidence that we are obviously missing as Christians.
Yeah, and likewise, I send out the invitation to any Muslim archaeologist or historian that wants to come forward and to demonstrate why Eric, Dr. J. Smith, Dr. Dan Gibson are all wrong. Please do come on and present your evidence. I'd love to hear it, but there is none, because these guys would be engaging with it if you had bothered to present it. And I think the reason why you've not bothered to present it is probably because it's not there. So let's move the discussion forward then. I'm firmly convinced that Mecca did not exist as a settlement for thousands of years. But let's play devil's advocate and try to imagine the sort of new apologetic that will emerge when Muslims finally get to grips with a lack of evidence, and them saying that actually the Kaaba, all that we're really talking about is the Kaaba temple, that place of worship, and it wasn't a settlement. It was all we need to say is that existed is the Kaaba house, and it may have been destroyed. How would you sort of respond to that? Because I suspect that's where they're going to go.
Well, I would refer them back to the Sunnah and the Hadith literature that describes civilizations and migrations of people living and trading there. So you would just use their own literature, the historical references from their own literature and events that are supposedly transcribed there in Mecca against them. Prove it. If this was a trade route, prove it. Show me on some map Mecca existing as a place of trade, because Muhammad supposedly was a trader for
Khadija.
There you go. I was thinking Aisha. No. That's the other way. That's older, much younger. Okay,
far too young. Too young a wife.
Yeah, So if he was supposedly a major trader, well, then he would have to be trading from Mecca. What goods are produced in Mecca to trade with other tribes elsewhere?
Amen. That's a great question.
So you would just turn it on their own, open the Sirah, open up the biography of Muhammad, and show them where Mecca is mentioned. And this was supposedly going on. It wasn't just a mere place of worship. It was supposed to be a place of trade.
From your reading of the Sirah and Hadith literature, roughly what size of a settlement do you reckon it's describing? A village, a town?
It is supposed to. In one of this, I can't remember what if it was from the Sirah or the Sunnah. It describes of armies coming from Mecca.
Well, that's my point, right? It's because that, like as if I'm stealing some kind of point that you guys haven't thought of. But the thing is, if you're going to field an army, then you've got to have a pretty big settlement.
Sure, you have to have a big population. Either that, or have your army is something from like a Monty Python movie or something, or just have a couple guys going out.
That kind of repictures the whole Battle of the Ditch, doesn't it? It's like 6 guys on that side chucking rocks at 4 guys on that side.
Going out there in metal and then falling down in a hole.
Not able to run around it. They built a hole. We can't do anything. The 4 of them have got us stuck. Yeah. It's because so like if there is no like when do you think personally Mecca became a settlement?
Probably around the 9th century.
Really?
Maybe.
When were those aqueducts built? Because for me, it's got to be pinned to the aqueducts.
Well, I would ask for the archaeological evidence for the aqueducts, and the dating of them.
If I can Google it.
And even with that, if you can't push it back in. There's, like I said, there's no evidence whatsoever for a 7th century Mecca. And again, here we start redacting the 4 caliphs. There's no evidence outside of Islamic literature for the 4 rightly guided caliphs. So if you have the second caliph, Umar's wife, building these aqueducts, then you have to show me that Umar is actually a historical figure outside of the Hadith literature. And when we look at again, you compare this to the biblical literature that we have all kinds of extra biblical evidence to supporting, of course, the life of Christ and the time of apostles. But we also have all kinds of extra biblical evidences demonstrating that King David was an actual king in Israel. And there are other historical figures within Judaism that date clear back to the 10th century BC. Here, all you have to do is just show me somebody that lived in the 7th century, named Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, or Ali. And the fact that you can't.
I mean, I've just Googled it to try and see if I can find when these aqueducts were built, because the aqueducts do exist. Well, I mean, I say they do exist. I'm going off basically just what I heard a historian state in passing. I don't know the reason why they say they exist. But if I've found the right person, and I'm not saying that I have, I'm just saying this is based on a 30-second Google search, Zubaydah bint Ja'far, who lived 200, who died 216 after Hijrah, so 200 years. So that would kind of line up with what you're saying. That would kind of line up with what you're saying.
Again, but the important point that we need to understand is that this literature, I'm suspecting, I might be wrong, but this citation comes from the Hadith or the Sirah. It does not come from extra Islamic, like we have extra biblical sources. We don't have extra Quranic sources. We don't have sources
for the aqueducts.
Correct.
Oh, right. Okay. I didn't realize.
So if we're saying that this guy that you're citing here mentions that this was built in the 2nd century AH, okay.
Tom Holland.
Okay, if Tom Holland's using it, Tom Holland's a pretty good historian. But
it's from memory.
Well, but again, where does that source come from? Is this from the Sunnah? Is this from the Hadith literature, or is this from the Sirah, or is this some other type of literature that was written at that time, prior to the 9th century? And this is the argument that Jay Smith is doing a really good job of making. We don't want to see 9th century, 10th century, 11th century literature. We want to see 7th century literature mentioning Muhammad, 7th century literature mentioning Mecca, 7th century literature pointing to all of these events, demonstrating that these events actually happened. And the fact is that we don't have them.
Well, just on that one, just sticking with the aqueduct, because if the aqueduct is an actual real fact of history, then that helps us to pinpoint when Mecca became a civilization, when Mecca became a real settlement. So reading very quickly from Wiki, so just bear that in mind. Wikipedia is not your first source to go to for historical knowledge, but you can go away and check whether it's accurate or not.
Right, yeah, you can check the sources for them.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, I'm just doing this on the hoof, so... But it says, on her 5th pilgrimage to Mecca, she saw a drought that had devastated the population and reduced the Zamzam well to a trickle of water. She ordered the well to be deepened and spent 2 million dinars improving the water supply of Mecca. I mean, that's a statement in itself. This included the construction of an aqueduct from the spring of Hunain, 95 kilometers to the east, as well as the famed spring of Zubaydah on the plain of Arafat. Now, 95 miles worth of aqueduct, we should maybe find something.
You would find it in, like I said, I don't. Where is? Like
we know where the aqueduct came from. We know where it went to, so we should be able to find something, because they're going to build this in as straight a line as possible. You're going to be able to find something to evidence whether that aqueduct was real. If the aqueduct was real, then we get a real fixed point in history when Mecca becomes a real settlement.
Well, this again, we have to consider the source of the literature, though. Just because it's named, just because
I'm saying that this is a test point in history. If we can find archaeological evidence of the aqueduct, then we find archaeological evidence of when Mecca becomes a settlement. But that's still late because she died. She lived. I'll give you her dates. She lived. Wait. Well, hold on. It just gives her death date. Where's her birth date? Okay, so she died 216 years after Hijra. So that's still two centuries too late.
This is past the Abbasid. And this is what I mentioned before, the Abbasids. I believe it was the Abbasids who redacted the history back on or into the Islamic practices. When we start talking about all of the sayings, the Sunnah, the Sirah, they heavily influenced all of that and redacted Mecca into that. Just think about it. Mecca's only mentioned one time in the Quran, one time by name. A city that important. Compare that to Jerusalem. How many times is Jerusalem mentioned in the Bible?
Yeah.
700-800 times?
Loads.
And then you look at Mecca and it's only mentioned one time. I believe that's purposeful. When we look at, again, you have Dan Gibson's work. Let me just cite this real quick. Dan Gibson's work talks about how many times, let's see here, geographical places are mentioned from the biblical literature to Islamic literature. And in the Gospel of Matthew, you have, okay, let me just say the Quran. The Quran, you have 77,000 words in the Quran, and you have 9 separate locations mentioned 65 different times. 77,000 words, 9 locations, 65 times. Wherein, let's say, the Gospel of Luke, you have 27,000 words. You have 31 separate locations mentioned 110 different times. That's just one gospel. Now, granted, Luke is the most descriptive gospel.
Yeah.
But if you go to the Gospel of Mark, 15,000 words, you have 26 locations mentioned 79 times. So when we start looking at,
it's an interesting omission.
Yeah, when you look at something that's made up, something that's fiction, a lot of the details are missing. And this is what Dan Gibson's providing in his book, Quranic Geography, is he's clearly demonstrating that the Quran is very short on details if you're trying to demonstrate that it developed in this region in which it did. And he also points out that a lot of the different locations of those 9 locations that are mentioned in the Quran, none of them are close to Mecca. He talks about Thalmud, which is way up in the north. He's talking about the people of Ad. These people are great distances away from Mecca. How do you travel? How do you interact with those type of people on a daily basis if they're mentioned in the Quran? So again, you have this. It's very vague and ambiguous when we're speaking about a book that claims to be very descriptive. And
also claims to be a clear explanation of all
exactly.
things.
That's what I was trying to say, right?
Yeah. Well, what about Dr. Rafa Amari? What's his? I'm guessing he's a Muslim who's tried to solve this conundrum.
Muslim historian, and he's just like
he's exactly the kind of person that we've just sent out the invite to.
I would definitely do it if you want to bring him on your channel. Again. He's like I was saying before, he places the development of Mecca in the 4th century. So he says that Mecca existed in the 7th century, but it didn't begin to exist until the 4th century, which again is very problematic when we start looking about the historicity of the Quran itself, claiming that Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba, 2,600 years prior to the existence of this city. Now, how does that happen? So I would definitely try to get him on your show.
Yeah.
See what his explanations are.
So sorry. I mean, I was slightly distracted. So his solution is what? That the Kaaba was built 2,600 years ago, but the city
the Kaaba. Let me bring up this article here and see if I can locate it for you.
Sorry, I just want his date, Eric. When does he say that Mecca was built as a settlement?
Let's see here. It was built long after Muslims claim it was. Challenged Muslims to take a fresh look. Let's see. Find Mecca. This suggests Mecca did not exist in the 3rd century AD. and he's citing Christian records, which would be, of course, he's throwing in there Greek records, Roman records.
Right. Is he doing
I think he's citing literature is what he ends up doing. I like I said, I didn't spend a lot of time on the end of the article. I spent it. Let's see. Well, even Dr. Patricia Corona says that it did not exist at that time. I'd have to get back with you on that one.
Okay, get back to us on that. So what Patricia Corona says that it wasn't around.
It didn't exist in the 7th century.
Patricia Corona says Mecca didn't exist in the 7th century.
Correct. Right. She said that it didn't begin to exist until I think her writings put it at the 9th century. Now, you got to remember, she's the one that debunked Montgomery Watts's trade route theory. She's the one that figured that out. So wait a second, that doesn't make any sense to go ahead and try to, ship goods across the desert when you got,
a perfectly good ocean. Yeah,
got a whole water
body of ocean to go around.
Yeah, why do that? So
exactly, no, that's a
she's the one that debunked that, but she's also, if you talk to Jay Smith, he'll tell you that she is the one that opened his eyes to all of these problems, these historical problems that you have with the city of Mecca and Islam itself. And it's just the absence of somebody that spends their life in academia and reads all kinds of different literature about that time period, about that region, and does not find anything on Mecca. That's somebody that I would definitely listen to.
And I mean, the implication you've laid out a couple of times, if Mecca didn't exist when it was said to exist, then the whole of Islamic history has to be revised considerably.
Well, it would have to, and here's which, when she did this, she got death threats. She had to move.
Yeah.
This, and Muslims understand the importance of this. They understand how critical it is to have Mecca for all those reasons that I listed there. I mean, this is the mother of all cities. This is the place where they bow 5 times a day. They go on Hajj once a year, once during their lifetime, or once a year ago, it happens there. All of these things are part of Islam. If you take that, they understand this. If you take that away, you destroy Islam. And this is why anybody that brings these types of things up is threatened.
No. I mean, the very fact that they reacted in the way that they did demonstrates the what a danger it posed to Islamic belief.
Well,
so
one of the
Muslims, it's really simple. Rather than threaten to kill people who raise these questions, just bring out the evidence that proves them wrong. Well, just bring out all the archaeological evidence. I mean, you've dug deep enough inside Mecca to do it. All you need to do is present all the history and go, look, you're wrong because we've got this, and you're wrong because we got. But you're not doing that. You're just threatening people, and that's a sign you've lost the argument.
You're right over the target when you're catching the most flack. When they are attacking you, you're right over the target, and this is one of those right over the target type topics. If you can demonstrate, and we have clearly demonstrate, that Mecca did not exist in the 7th century, or at least, and this is what's crazy. You would think that a civilization, a place as important as Mecca, the Almighty Allah, the Almighty God, would provide supporting, corroborating evidence for the historicity of your religious faith. He has provided nothing.
See, I wonder if possibly. So here's my conjecture, my sort of. Just a thought that's come to my own mind whilst I've been listening to your presentation, that perhaps what we see in the warlord that we call Muhammad, this historical figure, because I believe there was a historical figure called Muhammad, there was a real person. Whether that was his name or his title is a different question. But there was definitely, I think, there was definitely a warlord called Muhammad, who did go to Yathrib, who did establish a religious community, and who did wage war and then go on to invade Syria. And from that emerges proto-Islam that then later becomes classical Islam that we think of as Islam. And I wonder if perhaps he's one of the first or second generation of the first people really to settle in a place called Mecca around a temple. Like, that in the very recent past before that, he emerges as a holy figure from a religious site.
Mhm.
But at that point where he emerges and goes to Yathrib, Mecca is nothing but a tiny little outpost, a little village of people. Because he doesn't really become famous until he goes to Yathrib. He doesn't really get the whole Islamic calendar starts after Hijrah.
Right.
So he doesn't really get going until he goes to Medina, and his community doesn't really get going until it goes to Medina. And so I wonder if maybe the reason why there's such a cultural history amongst the Muslims connected to Mecca is because this man we call Muhammad was like first or second generation born amongst the very first settlers around the place we now called Mecca.
Well, the earliest credible references to Muhammad come in the form of a coin, 60 some odd years after
690, isn't it, or something like that?
Somewhere around there, right? But the problem with the coin is that it also has a Christian cross on it, also. But the description of these people we find in the John of Damascus, right here.
Was that coin minted by the Arabs, or did they just repurpose a Byzantine coin?
I'm not sure.
It's a question for Dr. J. Smith.
Right. Yeah, that would be something. Him. I can't remember who brought up that. If that was Mel who brought up the coin issue, or if it was Odin, or who was on. Jay. And Jay does a great job of articulating all of these finds that involve the historicity around Mecca. But when you start looking at some outsider commenting upon this religion, the earliest one that I'm aware of is John of Damascus, and he's an 8th century figure that lived in, of course, Damascus, and he was forced. I don't want to say forced; not a good word. He worked for the Muslims.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Worked for the Muslims in managing the city. And then he becomes a monk and then starts interacting with them theologically on their religious practices. So, you're talking a full 100 years after the death of Muhammad about these people. We start, seeing somebody from outside of that, their traditions, mentioning them. And they didn't call them Muslims either. He called them Saracens or...
I don't think he called them Saracens. I think he called them Ishmaelites. I think he might have called them Ishmaelites.
You're probably right with the Ishmaelites, because it would have been a theological term that he applied to them.
Yeah. I mean, I'm inching my way towards the idea, because I'm still in the camp that Mecca existed, but obviously in a very different form to what Muslims think that Mecca existed in. And this, I'm inching my way in the direction of saying, okay, maybe it didn't exist in the 7th century, but I'm not quite there yet. Because for me, there's got to be an explanation as to why Mecca became important. And I think that has to be connected to the birth of Islam. I don't think we can get away from that. But obviously, the evidence definitely shows that Mecca wasn't a city of any substance, certainly prior to the 7th century. Not that anyone seems to know of it. And I'm just wondering if perhaps it's some kind of, it was a religious site, and a little tiny outpost of people had kind of settled around this religious site, just like any religious site does. And that Muhammad was one of these people around this religious site who in his interactions becomes a monotheist, thinks himself in the light, continuing the work of Abraham, and then sees himself as sitting with the same God of Abraham and establishing the same religion as Abraham, and then goes on to become a warlord who fights other Arabs and establishes this kingdom out of almost nothing, before invading Syria and dying in Syria, but then getting ill and then dying in Medina.
Well, that definitely follows the standard narrative that we've been told.
Well, it's not quite, because I'm saying that Mecca was nothing but a chicken scratch of a hen coop and a temple of a place.
Right.
Like, it wasn't anything special.
Well, but then again, and this is my position. I'm not giving them the inch. I'm not going to even give them that. If you're going to say that Mecca existed, then the responsibility, the burden of proof of evidence is on you.
Absolutely.
The burden of evidence to demonstrate the historicity of the Gospels and who wrote the Gospels, or the existence of Jerusalem, all that. That's the responsibility of the Christian to demonstrate for their faith. The responsibility to demonstrate the existence of Mecca, even if you're saying that it is just a small hamlet of some sort, and you had a few people living around it that supported a pilgrimage to this temple. Well, then you're going to have to provide evidence that people were in fact migrating to that temple, which there is none. You're going to have to provide evidence of the existence of the temple in the 7th century, which there is none. There's all kinds of things that you're going to have, the requirements that you're going to have to meet in order to do that is on them. And this is the way I pretty much decided that, when we started engaging with them, this is the route I'm going to take. Show me the evidence.
It's absolutely fair. It's absolutely fair. I mean, they demand high levels of evidence from us, and so we should be exacting and demanding high levels of evidence from them. The only reason I'm just speaking my own personal position as I engage with this material, as I'm exposed to it, is is that for me, I've got to answer the question: well, why did Mecca become important at all? Do you know what I'm saying? And so for me, there's got to, in my head, I'm just speaking in my own thinking, there's got to be something that made Mecca special.
Are you aware of the Mormons here in the United States? You aware of the Mormon?
Yeah.
My thinking is it's essentially the same thing. You have a prophet, Joseph Smith, supposedly receiving revelations from God. And since it contradicts the standard narrative of the place that and plus, they didn't believe in polygamy in New York, makes this great pilgrimage across the United States, ends up getting himself killed, becomes a martyr for his faith. But the guy that follows him, Abu Bakr, or you could say
Jeffrey Young, wasn't it?
Brigham Young. They
yeah.
go to a place. They go to a place where they know that they are not going to be persecuted for their faith. They're not going to find confrontation. They are going to be able to practice this faith that has been revealed to them without any type of interference. And that was Salt Lake City. There was nobody, and I mean nobody. There was nobody in Salt Lake City during that time, during the 19th century, until they showed up. So once they showed up, they built their own city. They built their own culture, their own religious practices all around the teachings in the middle of nowhere. And Islam could have developed using the same type of history, where you have this group of people wanting to get, like the Abbasids, wanting to get away from conflict and being persecuted, going out in the middle of nowhere, and then redacting all of that history, all of those revelations that their prophet supposedly revealed. They're in the middle of nowhere.
Unfortunately, we don't. I think that's an interesting analogy, and it'd be an interesting thing to do the contrasts and comparisons between Mormonism, the birth of Mormonism, and the birth of Islam.
I'm going to tell you,
but I don't have time to do.
Okay, let me just tell you a real quick secret here. I'm a teacher. I'm a history teacher, and this is one of the standards that I have to teach is the development of Mormonism. We talk about the Mormon Trail and that faith. And
because they originally settled like somewhere else, didn't they? Before they settled in Salt Lake City, like they were persecuted. They got persecuted and driven out of some
in Illinois. They were in Illinois, and then they went across the great state of Iowa on their way out to, and they picked up the Oregon Trail and then cut south to what is now Salt Lake City. But the thing that I had a friend of mine propose, he goes, well, why don't you have your students compare and contrast the similarities between the Mormons and Islam?
It sounds like the angel Moroni. The devil Moroni was taking notes from the devil.
I would get in big trouble if I did that. I would never do that.
That was definitely a case of screw tape and his senior or junior. Okay, Eric, that was really wonderful, hugely informative. Thank you for taking time out of your day to share that information with you.
Absolutely.
I've waited for ages to have you on, and I've really
been a while,
appreciated it.
and I appreciate you bringing me. Yeah.
And I want to have you back. I like I say, you do brilliant. I love speaking to I'm a student of history, not a teacher of it, but I do find the whole approach interesting, and so thank you for taking that time. And we'll talk again.
Okay, thank you again. Thank you for having me on, Bob. I really appreciate it. Tomorrow, Crossing the Crescent. Tomorrow, we're talking about Muslim myths, things that we're told we have to believe about Islam. And like I said, it's a real good time we have on our show. A lot of it you can say as well, it's not academic, and you guys just have all these crazy discussions. We do. Like I said, it is a good time. So if you want to come, just go ahead and email me, and I'll send you.
Well, I'm coming on your show to talk about a topic soon, anyway. So.
Yes, May. I'm going to have you on in May. And I appreciate you coming.
We're going to be talking about. We're going to be doing some responses to certain da'i and their polemics. God bless you, Eric.
All right,
take care. Have a good night, and thank you so much.
All right. God bless you, Bob.
God bless. Take care. Bye. Good night, all.